This story is a fictional narrative created from speculation, incomplete accounts, and interpretations that were never officially verified. They say the wolf did not howl when it found the edge of the forest. It stood still. According to fragmented tellings, the animal appeared where no wolves were expected, thin, scarred, moving with a patience that felt learned rather than instinctive. Those who noticed it later said its eyes lingered too long on human paths, as if waiting for someone who would never arrive. The war had ended somewhere else. The goodbyes had not. The soldier's name is never spoken in these stories. Names would make it too real, too fixed. Instead, he exists as a presence that did not finish leaving, a life interrupted before it learned how to close itself. They say the last thing he felt was unfinished. Not fear, not pain, unfinished. What followed, if the stories are to be believed, was not rebirth in the way people imagine it. There were no memories snapping into place, no sudden understanding, only a pull toward cold air, toward movement, toward a body that could run when the mind could not speak. The wolf moved through terrain with a sense of recognition it could not explain. It avoided people, yet returned to places shaped by footsteps. It slept near roads, then vanished at dawn. And when it looked at houses lit from within, it did not approach. It waited. They say animals don't linger like that without reason, and this wolf lingered. On one particular night, told differently every time, the animal stopped near a clearing where the forest thinned and the world felt closer. It did not hunt. It did not rest. It simply faced the direction of a place it had never been. Or had it? The stories never claim the wolf knew who it had been. They suggest something quieter, that some goodbyes are heavier than bodies, and that when a life ends without closure, it may borrow another form, not to return, not to stay, but to finish what was left unsaid. Stories like this are rarely told with certainty. They arrive as whispers, as half-remembered accounts shared by people who insist they are not claiming truth, only repeating what they heard, what they felt, what they could not quite explain. According to those versions, this is not a story about war. It is a story about departure. The soldier did not return as a wolf to watch or protect. That would suggest intention. These tellings resist that idea. Instead, they speak of momentum, of a consciousness that did not stop moving when the body failed it. Movement, in these stories, is memory without language. Borrowed bodies is not about punishment or reward. It is about attachment, about the kind of bond that does not dissolve when breath does, about how love, once formed, does not always accept sudden endings. If you choose to continue listening, consider subscribing. Not for answers, but to follow stories where emotion outlives explanation. And if you're willing, leave a comment sharing where you're listening from. Distance shapes how these stories feel. What follows is not an account of reincarnation as belief. It is a narrative shaped by uncertainty, a reconstruction of moments that suggest a soldier, gone without farewell, found himself moving again in a body built for silence. A body that could not speak names, but could still feel direction, could still feel longing. This story does not ask you to decide whether reincarnation is real. It asks something simpler. What happens to a goodbye that never finds its way out? Because according to these tellings, the wolf did not come back to live again. It came back to leave. The first awareness did not arrive as memory. It arrived as cold. According to the versions passed along quietly, the soldier's return, if it can be called that, began not with recognition, but with sensation. Snow pressed into fur. Air burned the lungs. Muscles responded before thought existed to guide them. The body knew how to move. The mind did not know why. The wolf stood on uneven ground, its breath visible in the dark, every sound arriving sharper than it should have. Trees cracked in the distance. Wind carried information the body understood, but could not translate. There was no language for it, only urgency. Hunger came and went. Pain existed, but it felt distant, like something inherited rather than earned. What remained constant was direction. A pull that did not point north or south, but towards something unfinished. They say the wolf moved for days without resting properly, not fleeing, not hunting, traveling. Its path made little sense to anyone who later tried to trace it. It avoided prey it should have taken, past water it should have drunk, purpose over instinct. This imbalance is mentioned often in these tellings. Animals, they say, do not ignore instinct unless something stronger interferes. And whatever interfered here did not speak in words. It spoke in weight. At night, when the wolf finally rested, something like images surfaced. But they were broken, incomplete, not scenes, but impressions. Warmth without source, pressure in the chest, the echo of voices without sound, no faces, just the sense of others. According to the stories, this was when the confusion deepened. The wolf did not recognize itself as anything other than what it was. There was no thought of being human, no memory of hands or speech. And yet, when it crossed certain paths, old roads, abandoned clearings, it slowed. As if listening, the body reacted to places, not events, to spaces shaped by human presence. The wolf circled them cautiously, never entering fully, never retreating completely. It lingered on the edge. Edges mattered. One account describes the wolf stopping near a rusted signpost. Its meaning long faded. The animal stared at it until night fell, unmoving, breath steady. There was no reason for this pause, nothing to mark the place as significant, except the weight. The weight did not explain itself. It pressed inward, tightening something that had no name. The wolf lowered its head, not in submission, not in fatigue, but in recognition of pressure that did not belong to the body it wore. This pressure guided it onward. They say the wolf crossed terrain that should have deterred it. Steep inclines, open stretches with little cover. It moved as if exposure did not matter, as if something beyond survival had priority. Survival was assumed. Completion was not. At times, the wolf stopped and lifted its head toward the wind, not to howl. That never happened in these tellings. Instead, it inhaled deeply, as though searching for a scent that did not exist. What it was searching for could not be carried on air. It was carried inside. There are suggestions, never stated directly, that the wolf was being pulled toward a human presence tied to the soldier's final thoughts. Not a place of battle, not a symbol of duty, but a person. The tellings avoid specifics. They do not describe relationships. They do not explain bond. They only insist on one thing, that the pull was singular. Not toward many, toward one. This singularity shaped the wolf's movement. It ignored opportunities to join others of its kind, passed through territories without claiming them. It was not building a life. It was passing through one. As days turned into nights, the wolf's body adapted fully. Movement became efficient. Senses sharpened. Pain faded into background awareness. From the outside, there was nothing unusual about it anymore, except the pauses. Those pauses appeared at moments that defied logic. At the crest of a hill, at the edge of a stream, near lights visible in the distance. The wolf would stop and watch, unmoving, as if waiting for something to align. Alignment felt important. According to these stories, the wolf did not know what it was looking for, but it knew when it was closer. That knowledge did not come as certainty. It came as easing, a slight reduction in weight, a sense that movement required less effort, that each step carried less resistance than the one before. The soldier's consciousness, if that term even applies here, was not thinking. It was releasing, not all at once, gradually, and the wolf, unaware of what it carried, continued forward. Not to live a new life, not to replace the old one, but to bring something unfinished to its final edge, something that did not need words. Only presence, only arrival, only one last moment close enough to let go. The change began without announcement. According to the tellings, it did not arrive as revelation, but as imbalance. The wolf's movement slowed, not from exhaustion, but from something loosening. The pull that had guided it so relentlessly began to shift, no longer a straight line, but a widening field, as if the destination were no longer a point, but a presence. The wolf reached the edge of a settlement just before dawn, not a place marked on any map in these stories, just a scattering of human structures pressed against the forest, lights appearing and disappearing behind glass. The animal stopped where trees thinned and earth hardened underfoot. This was as far as instinct would normally allow. But instinct was not leading anymore. The wolf stayed. It did not step into open ground. It did not retreat. It stood at the threshold, body still, senses alert, as though waiting for permission that could not be given. According to some versions, this is where the weight changed texture. No longer heavy and pressing, it became dense and quiet, like something ready to be set down. The wolf lowered itself to the ground, not in rest, but in attention. A figure appeared shortly after. Not suddenly, not dramatically. A human shape moved within one of the buildings, light shifting behind a window. The wolf's ears lifted. Its breathing slowed. There was no surge of recognition, no rush of memory, only stillness deep enough to feel deliberate. They say this was the moment closest to knowing, not knowing who, knowing why. The wolf did not approach. It did not need to. Distance in these tellings was not separation. It was alignment without disruption. The animal remained where it was, eyes fixed not on the structure itself, but on the space around it, as if sensing the outline of someone rather than their form. Inside, the human paused. Accounts differ on whether this pause was noticed consciously. Some suggest the person felt watched. Others say they simply stopped for no reason, hand resting on a surface, breath held briefly, without explanation. What matters is not awareness. It is correspondence. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wolf did not move. The human did not look out. And yet, the weight shifted again. According to the stories, this was when the soldier's unfinished state began to dissolve, not through memory, but through proximity. Being near was enough. The need to cross space disappeared. The urgency that had driven movement released its grip. The wolf exhaled deeply, not a sound, a letting go. In that breath, something softened. The pressure in the body eased. The direction that had governed every step loosened into something diffuse, almost warm. The tellings never claim the soldier remembered his life. They suggest something subtler, that the emotion he carried finally found a place to land. The wolf lay still as the light grew stronger. The forest behind it remained unchanged. The human structures ahead continued their quiet rhythm. Nothing marked the moment as significant from the outside. Inside the animal, however, the pull faded. Not vanished. Completed. According to one version, the wolf lifted its head once more, not toward the building, but toward the sky just as light broke through cloud. It did not howl. It did not react. It simply breathed. This breath was different. Lighter. When the wolf finally stood, its posture had changed. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest that something no longer needed holding. The animal turned, not abruptly, not reluctantly, and moved back toward the forest. This time, the movement had no direction beyond survival, no urgency, no destination, just continuation. The wolf disappeared into the trees without looking back. Those who later claimed to have seen it said nothing about its eyes or its scars or its behavior. To them, it was only an animal returning to where it belonged. That, the stories insist, is the point. The soldier did not stay. He did not watch. He did not protect. He came only to finish leaving. And once that leaving was complete, the body that carried him no longer needed to. The human inside the building resumed their movement moments later. Unaware of what had passed at the edge of the forest, life continued without interruption. No message was delivered. No sign was left behind. Only a subtle easing. A feeling, later dismissed, of something having settled. Borrowed body stories rarely offer proof. They offer alignment. This one ends the same way, with a wolf returning to instinct, and a goodbye that finally found a place to rest. After the wolf disappeared into the forest, the world did not mark the moment. According to the tellings, nothing outward changed. The settlement woke as it always did. Lights turned off. Doors opened. The day arranged itself without interruption. Whatever had crossed the threshold between forest and human space left no trace that could be measured. And yet, something loosened. The person inside the building, the one the stories circle without naming, did not wake with a memory. There was no dream to interpret, no image to recall. What arrived instead was absence, a small but noticeable absence, like a sound that had stopped without anyone realizing it had been there. They moved through the morning slower than usual, not because of sadness, because something no longer pressed forward. According to these accounts, the person paused more often that day, at doorways, at windows, in moments that usually passed unnoticed. Each pause carried no clear thought, only a sensation of being slightly lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally completed itself. Completion in these stories is rarely dramatic. It is subtle enough to be dismissed. The forest remained unchanged. No tracks were found. No signs lingered. If the wolf had passed through, it had done so without disturbance. Animals resumed their patterns. The land closed behind the movement. Nature did not remember. Humans rarely notice when something ends quietly. Over the following days, the person experienced changes that resisted explanation. Not relief exactly. Relief suggests recognition, but an easing of tension that had never been consciously identified as tension before. They slept through the night. This detail appears often. Not deep asleep, just uninterrupted. According to some versions, this was the first time in years that rest did not feel provisional, as though waiting for interruption. The body no longer braced itself without reason. Muscles released habits they had formed without instruction. Habits formed in response to absence are hard to name. The stories avoid suggesting the person understood any of this as connected to loss. There was no sudden grief resolved, no realization of what had been missing. The soldier's existence remained unknown, unremembered. What changed was not knowledge. It was weight. They moved differently through familiar spaces. Certain objects no longer drew their attention. Certain sounds no longer triggered pause. The future felt marginally less crowded with unnamed concern. Concern without origin is difficult to carry. According to these tellings, the person did not feel watched anymore. This does not mean they had ever felt watched consciously. Rather, the sense of being accompanied by something unplaceable, something always just behind the present moment, had faded. Faded things are noticed only in their absence. The wolf, now fully animal again, resumed its life without deviation. It hunted. It rested. It avoided humans instinctively. Nothing in its behavior suggested memory or purpose beyond survival. This detail matters. Borrowed body stories resist the idea of permanent overlap. They suggest that borrowed forms are temporary carriers, not vessels for continued identity. Once the weight is set down, the body returns to itself. The wolf did not carry the soldier forward. It released him. According to some tellings, there were moments when the wolf paused in places it had never visited before. Not to linger, just to orient. These pauses lacked the density of the earlier ones. They were instinctive, not directed. Instinct had reclaimed priority. The soldier's presence, if it can be called that, did not move on. It did not drift. It did not watch from elsewhere. It simply ended. This ending did not announce itself. It resolved. The person inside the settlement continued life without story. Days unfolded. Decisions were made. Joy and worry returned in familiar shapes. Nothing suggested an encounter had occurred. And yet, something had concluded. The tellings emphasize this contrast, that endings do not require acknowledgement to be real, that closure can happen without awareness, that goodbyes do not need witnesses to be completed. In these stories, the soldier did not seek remembrance. He sought release. Release does not leave monuments. It leaves space. That space, according to those who share this story, was filled not with meaning, but with normalcy. And normalcy, after long absence, can feel miraculous. The person did not change their life. They simply lived it without an invisible tether. Borrowed bodies narratives often end not with revelation, but with quiet redistribution of weight, of tension, of unfinished emotion. This chapter sits in that quiet aftermath where nothing can be proven and nothing needs to be. Because if the story is true, and these tellings never insist that it is, then the most important part did not happen when the wolf arrived. It happened when the wolf left, and what it took with it was not memory. It was the need to return. In the days that followed, the absence settled into routine. According to the tellings, this was the most convincing part of the story. Not the appearance of the wolf, not the alignment at the forest's edge, but how completely ordinary everything became afterward. Life resumed without resistance, as though a quiet obstruction had been removed from its path. The person did not reflect on change. Reflection would have required contrast. Instead, days simply felt less heavy. Choices came with less hesitation. Moments passed without the subtle drag that had once accompanied them. The body moved forward without checking behind itself. This detail appears again and again in retellings. The sense of being alone changed, not into loneliness, into solitude. Solitude, in these stories, is not emptiness. It is space without pressure, space that belongs entirely to the present moment, unshared with echoes of what never arrived or never returned. The person found themselves doing small things they had avoided without knowing why, walking longer routes, standing outside longer than necessary, letting silence stretch without filling it. None of these actions felt intentional. They simply happened. According to some versions, there were moments when the person glanced toward the forest without curiosity, without tension. The forest was just landscape again, not a boundary, not a presence, just trees. This neutrality mattered. Before, though the stories never explain how, the forest had carried something unnamed, a sense of proximity that did not belong to the present. That sense was gone. The wolf, meanwhile, became indistinguishable from any other. Those who later claimed to have seen it again did not describe anything unusual. No lingering, no hesitation near human paths, no pauses that suggested memory. The animal existed fully within instinct now. This return is essential to borrowed bodies' narratives. They do not portray reincarnation as fusion. They portray it as passage. The borrowed form is not transformed by what it carries. It is used briefly, then released. Once released, it does not look back. According to these tellings, nothing of the soldier remained in the wolf, and nothing of the wolf remained in the soldier. The exchange left no residue. What changed was not identity. It was completion. The person inside the settlement began noticing time differently, not as something moving too fast or too slow, but as something that simply moved. There was no longer a sense of waiting for a moment that had no name. Waiting, in this story, had not been conscious. That is what made it heavy. Unconscious waiting drains without explanation. When it ended, the relief was quiet enough to be mistaken for nothing at all. The tellings emphasize that this is how most endings happen. Not with clarity, but with disappearance. A problem dissolves before it is identified. Attention releases before it is named. By the time it is noticed, it is already gone. Some versions include a detail of weather changing shortly after. Not dramatically, just a shift in temperature, a different quality of light. These details are never framed as sign, only as coincidence. Borrowed bodies' stories avoid symbolism. They prefer alignment. Alignment does not announce meaning. It allows things to rest where they belong. The soldier's story, as reconstructed here, did not leave behind lessons or messages. No warning, no instruction, no proof of anything beyond possibility. If something returned, it was not memory. It was balance. The person did not become aware of what had been lost, because loss had already been processed elsewhere. The goodbye had been delivered in silence, through proximity rather than words. Words were never required. This is why these stories resist explanation. Any attempt to define what happened would shrink it, would turn it into belief or denial. Neither fits. Instead, the story remains open, not unresolved, unclaimed. According to those who repeat it, this is the most honest ending, that a soldier who never said goodbye did not need to speak in order to leave. that a body borrowed for movement did not need to remember what it carried, and that when something finishes properly, it does not ask to be remembered. It simply stops asking to return. Absence does not stay contained. According to the tellings, once the weight lifted from the person closest to the forest, it did not vanish entirely. It redistributed, not as burden, but as quiet influence, subtle shifts that moved outward without announcing themselves. This is how unfinished things often resolve, not by disappearing, but by dissolving into the world around them. The settlement continued as before, yet small interactions felt slightly altered. Conversations lingered a fraction longer. Silences felt less strained. People paused without discomfort, as though waiting no longer carried urgency. No one spoke of change. Change, when gentle, is rarely named. According to some versions, the people closest to the unnamed person noticed something they could not define. Not happiness, not relief, something calmer, a steadiness that had not been present before, the kind that does not seek reassurance. This steadiness mattered. It suggested that something internal had settled. Not recently, but finally. The stories never claim this steadiness came from understanding. No memory surfaced. No realization connected the forest, the wolf, or the idea of a soldier lost elsewhere. The change did not arrive as meaning. It arrived as alignment. Alignment does not explain itself. It simply allows things to occupy their proper weight. Borrowed bodies narratives often linger here, on the idea that emotional residue can exist without conscious memory, that grief, once unresolved, does not vanish when ignored. It waits, and when it finds the right conditions, it releases. The soldier's release, if these tellings are to be believed, did not correct the past. It did not rewrite loss. It did not comfort those who never knew him. It only ended the pull, and when a pull ends, everything around it reorients. The forest became ordinary again. This detail appears repeatedly. The trees no longer felt watchful. The edge where wild met human no longer carried tension. People passed it without slowing. Children played near it without hesitation. Ordinary spaces reclaimed themselves quickly. The wolf was not seen again near the settlement. This absence is not framed as disappearance. Wolves move. They belong elsewhere. The fact that it did not return carried no significance to those who noticed, only to those telling the story later, searching for endpoints. According to some tellings, a different kind of animal appeared in the area months later. Not as replacement, just as presence. Life continued without narrative. This continuation reinforces the central idea. The borrowed body was never meant to stay. Borrowed bodies' stories reject permanence. They suggest that borrowed forms exist only long enough to allow motion where motion was interrupted. Once movement completes its arc, the form is released back into instinct. Instinct does not remember. Instinct continues. The wider world, unaware of any of this, absorbed the resolution without ceremony. The war remained something spoken of elsewhere, in other places, with other consequences. The soldier remained unnamed, unmarked, unremembered by history. History did not require his return. Only his ending did. According to the tellings, this is what separates these stories from belief systems. They do not promise reunion. They do not offer comfort through recognition. They offer something quieter. The idea that some endings occur without witnesses because witnesses are not required. Witnesses complicate closure. Closure, in this telling, was private. The person who had carried the weight unknowingly never learned why it had lifted. And because they never learned, they did not attach meaning to it. They did not turn it into story. They did not carry it forward. That matters. Stories only persist when someone needs them. This one did not need persistence. It needed release. As time passed, the subtle changes faded into normalcy. Normalcy is persuasive. It convinces people that nothing unusual ever happened, that things were always this way. Normalcy is how endings hide. According to those who still share this story, that is its final act, to disappear so completely that even its resolution leaves no trace, no lesson, no warning, no proof, only balance restored so quietly that it feels like nothing at all. Borrowed body stories insist on this restraint. They do not reward curiosity. They do not punish disbelief. They sit in the space between, suggesting that if something did occur, it did so without needing acknowledgement. And perhaps that is the most respectful kind of goodbye. Not one that demands to be remembered, but one that allows life to continue without interruption. The soldier did not return to be seen. He returned to stop returning. And once that need ended, the world closed around the absence without ceremony, just as it does around all things that finish quietly, without insisting on meaning. What followed did not take the shape of memory. According to the tellings, the story did not travel forward through those who were closest to it. It moved sideways, through people who had no connection to the soldier, no knowledge of the wolf, and no reason to notice anything unusual at all. This sideways movement is essential to borrowed bodies' narratives. They are not carried by witnesses. They are carried by atmosphere. Months later, someone passing through the settlement mentioned the forest felt different, not safer, not warmer, just quieter, in a way that resisted description. They did not linger on the comment. It was said in passing, without meaning attached. That is how these stories survive, not through importance, through repetition, without intention. Another version speaks of a traveler who paused at the forest edge without knowing why. They did not feel watched. They did not feel drawn in. They simply stood still for a moment longer than expected, then moved on. Stillness in these accounts is residue, not of presence, of completion. Borrowed bodies. Stories suggest that when something unresolved finally finishes, it leaves behind a field that no longer pulls. The absence of pull is felt not as loss, but as neutrality, a space that does not ask anything of those who enter it. Neutral spaces feel ordinary, and ordinary things are rarely remembered. According to the tellings, this is why the story only surfaces later, when someone tries to explain a feeling that no longer exists. They remember tension more easily than its release. They remember waiting more clearly than its end. Endings without drama are hard to locate. They do not anchor memory. The soldier's borrowed return did not create folklore immediately. There were no sightings that demanded explanation, no patterns that begged to be connected. The wolf had come and gone without leaving disturbance. Disturbance is what creates stories. Completion dissolves them. It was only much later, told differently each time, that someone mentioned the idea of a soldier who never said goodbye. The story did not arise from observation. It arose from empathy, from imagining what it would mean to leave without closure. Empathy fills gaps that facts cannot. The tellings never claim the story was true. They suggest it felt necessary. Necessary stories do not depend on evidence. They depend on resonance. According to these accounts, the resonance of this story lies in its restraint. The soldier did not return to speak. He did not return to be recognized. He did not return to be remembered. He returned to finish something private. That privacy protected the ending from being turned into symbol. Symbols demand interpretation. This story resists it. People who hear it are not asked to believe in reincarnation. They are asked to consider momentum, how emotion can continue moving even when the body stops, and how that movement might seek a form long enough to conclude. Conclusion does not require permanence. It requires alignment. Borrowed bodies. Narratives often end in this quiet diffusion, where the story no longer belongs to anyone involved. It becomes something shared loosely, without ownership. A story told without insistence. If you listen closely to how it is repeated, the details shift. The animal changes. The setting changes. The relationship implied changes. What remains constant is the structure. A life ends abruptly. Something remains unfinished. A borrowed form carries the weight. The weight is set down. Then everything continues. This consistency is what makes the story durable, not accuracy. Pattern. Patterns persist because they mirror internal experience. Many people carry things they never named. Many people feel pulls they cannot explain. The idea that such pulls might one day release without confrontation is comforting, not as belief, but as possibility. Possibility is enough. According to the tellings, the forest eventually lost its association with anything unusual. New stories replaced old ones. Time layered over the space until nothing of the original alignment remained. This erasure is not failure. It is success. The soldier did not return to create legend. He returned to disappear completely. And disappearance, when it comes after completion, is not loss. It is rest. Borrowed body stories rarely offer endings that feel satisfying in the way stories usually do. There is no reveal, no confirmation, no reward for attention. Instead, they offer something closer to truth. If truth here means emotional accuracy rather than factual claim, some things do not need to be remembered to be finished. Some goodbyes are not meant to be heard. And some returns are not meant to last long enough to be recognized. They exist only long enough to allow something to stop moving. And once it stops, the world does what it always does. It continues, quietly, without explanation, as if nothing had ever been waiting there at all. Time did not close around the story evenly. According to the tellings, even after the forest returned to neutrality and the settlement forgot whatever it had never consciously known, something remained unsettled. Not in place, but in implication. The story lingered not as event, but as possibility. Possibility is harder to erase than memory. People who later heard fragments of the story did not speak of wolves or soldiers at first. They spoke of timing, of how certain endings seem delayed beyond reason, as if waiting for a form that has not yet been offered. This is how borrowed body stories widen. They stop belonging to one life. They begin reflecting many. According to some versions, the story resurfaced years later through someone entirely removed from the original setting, a person who had lost someone abruptly, without words exchanged, without final contact. This person did not know the forest, had never seen a wolf, but they recognized the shape of the story immediately. Recognition did not come from belief. It came from familiarity. They spoke of a sense that something had not fully stopped moving when death arrived. Not as presence, not as haunting, but as momentum. The feeling that a goodbye had been interrupted mid-motion. Momentum seeks outlet. Borrowed bodies' narratives suggest that when no outlet exists, the momentum lingers, pressing lightly against unrelated lives, not to enter them, but to remind them that completion matters. This reminder does not instruct. It resonates. According to these tellings, people who encountered the story later did not feel comforted in the traditional sense. They felt steadied, as though the idea that something unfinished could find its own conclusion without their intervention offered a quiet relief. Relief without explanation is rare. The soldier's story, now distant from its origin, became less specific with each retelling. The animal changed. Sometimes it was a wolf. Sometimes something else that moved between human and wild spaces. The setting shifted. Forests became plains. Borders blurred. What remained constant was the role. A life ends too quickly. Something remains unresolved. A borrowed form carries the remainder. The remainder is set down. Then, nothing dramatic follows. This structure persisted because it mirrored an emotional truth many people recognized, but could not articulate. That closure does not always arrive through conversation, that not every goodbye is spoken, that some endings complete themselves without witnesses. Witnesses in these stories are unnecessary. Completion is private. According to later versions, this idea became the quiet center of the narrative. Not reincarnation as cycle, not souls moving visibly between forms, but consciousness, if that word applies, continuing only long enough to release its final attachment. Attachment, not identity. The soldier was never said to be the wolf. The wolf was never said to become the soldier. The form was borrowed. Borrowing implies return. Return implies respect. This distinction kept the story from becoming doctrine. It resisted belief systems. It refused rules. It remained a suggestion rather than an explanation. Suggestion is durable. People return to the story not to understand it, but to place something of their own inside it. An ending they never had. A goodbye that never reached its destination. In this way, the story did not preserve the soldier. It honored the act of leaving. According to some tellings, this is why the wolf never lingered in memory. It was not meant to be remembered. Remembering would anchor the story too firmly. It would make it about the animal rather than the movement. Movement was the point. By the time the story reached its later listeners, the soldier had dissolved entirely. There was no sense of who he was, where he came from, or how he died. These details had no function anymore. What remained was the pattern. A pattern that suggested something hopeful without promising anything. That endings can complete themselves. That silence can still deliver meaning. That something unfinished does not always stay that way forever. This chapter of the story does not add new events. It adds distance. Distance allows resonance. And resonance, once established, no longer depends on truth. It depends on recognition. The soldier's borrowed return had finished long ago. But the shape of it continued to move, quietly, through people who needed a way to imagine that something unresolved might one day stop asking to be carried. Distance altered the story without weakening it. According to the tellings, as time carried the narrative farther from its origin, the need to anchor it to a single moment or form diminished. The wolf became less an image and more a function. The forest became less a place and more a threshold. What listeners carried forward was not detail, but permission. The permission to imagine that endings might arrive without being demanded. This permission mattered. People who encountered the story later did not repeat it as explanation. They repeated it as reassurance. Not reassurance that loss could be undone, but that loss might finish its work quietly, without requiring participation from those left behind. The idea settled gently. Borrowed bodies' stories often work this way. They do not ask listeners to believe. They invite them to rest with possibility. Possibility does not insist. It offers space. According to some versions, the story was shared most often at moments when language failed, when someone had nothing helpful to say, when consolation felt intrusive. The story did not provide answers. It provided patience. Patience without expectation. Listeners did not come away feeling enlightened. They felt less compelled to resolve what could not be resolved. The notion that something might complete itself, elsewhere, unseen, removed a burden many did not realize they were carrying. Burden is easiest to carry when unnamed, hardest to release. The soldier's role in the story became increasingly abstract. He was no longer imagined as a person with a face or history. He became a stand-in for interruption itself, for lives that stop mid-sentence, for words that never reach their listener. Interruption demands completion. The borrowed form, whatever shape it took in retellings, served only one purpose: movement without language, a way to finish a sentence that could not be spoken. Once finished, the form released itself back into instinct. Instinct does not linger. This principle protected the story from spectacle. There were no signs, no miracles, no confirmations offered to the curious. Those who sought proof found none. Those who sought meaning found only alignment. Alignment is personal. According to the tellings, this is why the story aged without conflict. It did not challenge beliefs. It did not compete with explanations. It existed beside them, offering an alternative shape for understanding endings that resist closure. The person at the forest's edge, the one closest to the story's quiet center, never learned of the narrative. This absence of knowledge remained essential. Knowing would have turned coincidence into message. Message would have demanded interpretation. Interpretation would have complicated release. Instead, the release remained intact. As the story continued to circulate, the idea of the borrowed body became less literal. It came to represent any brief passage through a form not meant to last. A moment where something unfinished borrows time, motion, or presence, only long enough to conclude. Conclusion does not always require awareness. This idea allowed the story to belong to many without belonging to anyone. No one could claim it. No one could correct it. It remained adaptable, quiet, and resistant to certainty. Certainty would have fixed it in place. Borrowed bodies stories avoid fixation. They move until they don't. According to later retellings, the most common reaction to the story was not wonder, but relief. Relief that endings might not depend on confrontation. relief that unfinished things could find their own way to stop asking. This relief did not erase grief. It softened its edges. Softening is not resolution. It is accommodation. The story did not tell people how to grieve. It told them they did not have to rush it. That if something remained unsettled, it might not remain so forever, even if no one knew when or how. This idea, repeated quietly, altered how people held absence. Absence became less like a wound and more like a space, still painful, but not demanding constant attention. Attention exhausts. Release restores. By the time the story approached its final retellings, the wolf had nearly vanished from description. Sometimes it was mentioned only in passing. Sometimes not at all. The story no longer needed an animal. It needed only the idea of passage. Passage from urgency to rest, from interruption to completion, from movement to stillness. This shift prepared the story for its final chapter. Not an ending, but a settling, a recognition that what mattered had already occurred, and that nothing further was required. The soldier had finished leaving long ago. What remained was the quiet influence of that completion, diffused through retellings that asked for nothing and promised nothing. In Borrowed Bodies narratives, this is the moment where the story stops expanding. Not because it has been explained, but because it has been absorbed. Absorbed stories do not need continuation. They sit lightly in the background of thought, available but unobtrusive. They surface when needed, then recede without insistence. The soldier's borrowed return had become such a story, not something to remember, something to allow. Allowance, in the end, is the final gift these stories offer. The permission to believe that some goodbyes, no matter how delayed, find their way home, quietly, without asking to be seen. The final chapter of the story does not introduce anything new. According to the tellings, it does the opposite. It removes what is no longer needed. By the time the story reaches this point, the soldier has ceased to exist as a figure. There is no image left to carry, no form to imagine. What remains is only the effect, subtle, diluted, and almost indistinguishable from ordinary life. This is intentional. Borrowed Bodies stories do not end with revelation. They end with normalization. The extraordinary dissolves back into the familiar until it can no longer be separated from it. According to later retellings, people who hold this story longest do not replay the beginning. They revisit the ending, not the wolf, not the forest, but the moment when nothing further happened. That moment matters more than any event, because it suggests completion without display. The idea settles into the listener quietly, that some lives do not need to be remembered to be finished. That meaning does not always announce itself. That closure can occur without witnesses, ceremonies, or acknowledgement. Acknowledgement in this story would have been intrusion. The soldier's return was never meant to be known. It was meant to be sufficient. According to the tellings, this understanding changes how the story feels when remembered later. It stops being about reincarnation. It becomes about timing, about how endings sometimes arrive long after beginnings have faded. This distance reframes loss. Loss is no longer only absence. It becomes something with direction, something that moves until it settles. The soldier's life ended violently and abruptly, according to the fragments. But the ending of his presence did not mirror that violence. It was quiet. It was careful. It was complete. This contrast carries emotional weight, not because it redeems what happened, but because it suggests that interruption is not the final word, that something unfinished may continue only long enough to finish itself. Finish, not return. The story insists on this distinction. The soldier did not come back to live again. He did not come back to be recognized. He did not come back to fix the past. He came back to stop being pulled forward by it. Pull is the enemy of rest. Once the pull ended, nothing else was required. According to some versions, people who hear this story during moments of grief do not feel comforted immediately. Instead, they feel permitted to stop forcing closure, to stop searching for signs, to stop demanding answers from silence. This permission is the story's final function, not to explain death, to release the living from the need to resolve what cannot be resolved. The borrowed body, by this stage, is no longer imagined as an animal. It becomes any temporary state that allows motion where motion was previously impossible. A dream, a ritual, a passing thought. A story told once, then set down. Once set down, it does not need to be revisited. Borrowed bodies narratives end here because there is nowhere else to go. Any continuation would undo what has already been completed. Any added detail would turn release into attachment. Attachment would restart the movement. This story refuses that. According to the tellings, the most honest ending is the one where the story steps aside and lets ordinary life resume fully, without shadow or explanation. The soldier does not linger. The wolf does not return. The forest remains only forest. And yet, something has shifted. Not visibly, but permanently. The listener may never think of the story again. That is not failure. That is success. The story has done its work and removed itself. Work that leaves no trace is rare. It requires restraint. The soldier's borrowed return was an act of restraint. Movement without demand, presence without claim, departure without audience. By the time the story reaches this final phase, even the idea of goodbye feels unnecessary. Goodbye implies separation between two aware parties. This ending required only one, the one who needed to leave. And he did, not dramatically, not memorably, but fully, which, according to these tellings, is the only ending that truly lasts. What remained after completion was not silence. It was balance. According to the tellings, once the soldier's momentum fully released, the story stopped exerting pressure on anyone who carried it. This absence of pressure is difficult to describe because it feels like nothing, and nothing is rarely noticed unless something heavy preceded it. The heaviness had gone, not lifted suddenly, not removed dramatically, simply no longer present. Borrowed bodies. Stories often conclude in this state, where the end is defined not by action, but by stillness that no longer requires explanation. The soldier's return did not leave behind questions demanding answers. It left behind an easing so complete that curiosity itself faded. Curiosity feeds on tension. Without tension, it starves. According to later retellings, people who once repeated the story eventually stopped doing so, not because it lost meaning, but because it no longer asked to be spoken. Stories that complete their purpose tend to retreat naturally. They do not demand preservation. This withdrawal is part of the story's integrity. To remain would imply unfinished business. To fade suggests fulfillment. The borrowed body, so central at the beginning, no longer holds narrative weight here. Whether it was a wolf or something else entirely, becomes irrelevant. The form served its function and was released. The release mattered more than the carrier. Carriers are temporary. Completion is not. According to these tellings, this is why the story resists interpretation. Any attempt to frame it as belief or metaphor misses its quiet intention. It was never meant to instruct. It was meant to conclude. The soldier's life, interrupted by violence and urgency, ended twice. Once abruptly, and once carefully. The second ending did not undo the first. It did not redeem it. It did something more modest and more difficult. It stopped the movement. Movement without destination is exhausting. Once stopped, rest becomes possible. Rest in borrowed bodies narratives is not sleep. It is the absence of pull, the absence of reaching, the absence of something leaning forward into time, waiting for alignment. The soldier no longer leaned. The world no longer leaned toward him. They met in stillness. This meeting did not produce memory. It did not produce witness. It produced completion without residue. That residue-free ending is what allows life to continue without distortion. According to some versions, this is why the story never insists on being true. Truth would anchor it too firmly. It would demand proof, defense, belief. The story does not want belief. It wants release. Release is incompatible with certainty. Release requires permission to let go without knowing. This permission is the final offering of the story. It does not say that all unfinished things will find closure. It suggests only that some do. and that they do so quietly, without consultation, without spectacle. The soldier did not choose the form he borrowed. The form did not choose what it carried. Neither retained what passed through. This mutual impermanence is the story's quiet ethic. Nothing is owned. Nothing is claimed. Nothing lingers beyond necessity. According to the tellings, this is the most respectful ending possible. One that does not turn suffering into lesson or loss into meaning. One that allows what happened to remain what it was. Unjust, abrupt, incomplete, while still allowing the movement it created to stop. Stopping is enough. The story does not argue for hope. It offers rest. Rest for those who imagine the soldier. Rest for those who imagine the wolf. Rest for those who carry endings they never understood. And rest in this context is not comfort. It is finality, without erasure. The soldier is not remembered. He is finished. That distinction matters. Remembering would keep him moving. Finishing allows him to stop. Borrowed bodies. Stories end here because any continuation would contradict their purpose. To go on would be to reopen what has already closed itself. This story does not reopen. It closes quietly, without ceremony, without witness, without insistence. And in doing so, it leaves behind something rare, a sense that not all unresolved things must remain unresolved forever, and that when resolution comes, it may arrive so gently that it feels like nothing at all, which is often how true endings feel, unnoticed, complete, at rest. Stories like this do not end with certainty. They end with quiet. According to the way this narrative has been shared over time, what matters is not whether the soldier truly returned or whether a wolf ever carried anything beyond instinct. What matters is the space left behind when something unfinished finally stops asking to be carried. That space feels different for each listener. For some, it feels like relief without cause. For others, like the absence of attention they never knew how to name. Borrowed bodies. Stories do not argue that consciousness survives. They suggest something narrower and perhaps more fragile, that unfinished emotion can move briefly until it finds a place to rest. And once it rests, it does not announce itself, it disappears. The soldier did not come back to be remembered. He did not return to be honored, explained, or understood. He returned only long enough to finish leaving. And once that movement was complete, nothing remained that needed to stay. That restraint is the story's quiet center. Not return. Not rebirth. Release. Release does not comfort loudly. It does not prove anything. It does not demand belief. It simply allows life to continue without the invisible pull of what never reached its ending. If this story lingers with you, let it linger gently. Not as evidence, not as truth, but as permission. The permission to imagine that some goodbyes, no matter how delayed, find their way home without being spoken, and that when they do, they leave no trace behind. Only balance, only stillness, only the ordinary world, unchanged, quietly carrying on.